There were quite a few mistakes I was guilty of on my first playthrough of Fallen Dynasty that could have saved me so much trouble had I avoided them. That's why today we're going to go over even more tips that you should know and a few tricks to better farm for your perfect build. As always, if you like these videos and want to see more guys like these on the channel, a like would be awesome, and let's dive right in. Coming up first, having a lower weight factor might actually have a lot more benefits than I initially thought, and we talked about the fact that this will affect both the cost of martial arts and dodges and the effectiveness of the dodge animations. So Fallen Dynasty has 4 weight categories from A to D, with 3 of them being shown via the bar icon next to your gear whenever you inspect your inventory. So there's the lightweight, which goes from 0 to 30%, medium weight from 30 to 70, and then heavy from 70 to 99. And technically there's also the overweight, which exceeds 100% limit and technically also applies a debuff on your character that makes it move slower and makes the dodges almost impractical. Now, one of the first things you'll notice changing is the dodge animation. For example, in the case of a heavyweight set, this gives you a dodge roll that's slightly less effective and a bit slower. Meanwhile, in the case of a lightweight, this has a dodge spin animation instead that happens much quicker and likely is better at avoiding damage. Second of all, the cost of the dodges also goes way down with a lighter set. For example, with the heavy version, I can only pull about 4 of these in a row before hitting the cooldown and having to wait for it. But with a lightweight set, I can just do it almost infinitely, as they barely cost anything, so it's a perfect option for any enemy that tends to spam its attacks. A third even greater difference is that martial arts cost can also be heavily influenced by the heavyweight or the lightweight. In this case, pretty much like the cost of the dodges, I can perform about 4 martial arts before hitting the spirit cap with a heavy set, but with a lightweight, I can just do it 7 times back to back, which is actually awesome as the consumption is almost half of what it normally is with a heavier one. And there's a final benefit with a lower weight, which includes a slightly faster spirit regen. In the case of the heavy set, it would require almost 15 seconds for that bar to go to balance again. Meanwhile, for the light one, it only required about 12. Despite all of this, I would still not go with a full light set, as that would just not mitigate enough of the damage, especially in New Game Plus, but it's totally viable to go with a medium one, somewhere between 30 to 70%, and get best of both worlds while still having a pretty good regen on your best attacks. Coming up to number 2, another mistake is salvaging, or even more so selling your items early on instead of more so paying attention to the special effects that you can transfer to your gear first. These special effects fall into 2 categories: the more common ones, which provide flat buff benefits such as HP, damage increase, and so on. Meanwhile, there's also the jewelry essences that behave kinda like buffs when performing certain actions, such as damage bonus on martial arts and so on. The problem is that only the jewelry essences seem to be given back from salvaging and not the flat common buffs, which can still actually be quite useful since you can stack them on all gear pieces and eventually they do add up. So early on, what you'll want to do is to actually use the embed mechanic and just extract the desirable effects or common buffs from these gear pieces and transfer them to the ones from your main set, and in this way you can ensure you have a good build early on that carries you through the game and you don't lose these beneficial effects. The only exception to this rule are trinkets, which don't seem to be affected by the embedding mechanic, and even more so, they don't provide anything other than jewelry fragments, so they can technically be sold for an extra profit. Moving on to number 3, you can infinitely reroll trinkets with a simple trick at any of the pandas you find in most of the chapters. It's especially useful if you already got at least one 5-star item from playing in the New Game Plus, which is going to let you get an equivalent trinket from these pandas by feeding it a useless 5-star item that you don't use. For example, there's one panda very early in chapter 3 and also very close to a control point, so what you can do in this case is to just feed it an item of 5-star quality and see if you like the trinket it gives you. If you don't like it, you can completely restart the level and feed back the trinket that it previously gave you until you get one that you like. If not, there's an even faster route, and what you can do is to save at the control point very close to that panda and then try to feed the item again. If again the result is undesirable, what you can do is to just exit at the main menu, which is going to roll back you right before feeding it, and you can redo this infinitely until you get a trinket that comes with the perfect stats. Moving on to number 4, always pay attention to weapon scaling and keep in mind that this will oftentimes change as you level it up. All weapons have a scaling listed on the item preview, and it can go anywhere from D to A, where the more you have towards A, the more it gets influenced in terms of damage by that respective stat. So for example, my dual swords had an A- scaling early on into water, but only a C in fire. So in this case, I was forced to invest more points into water so that that damage can go a lot up. But once I reached level 8 with this sword, it started getting an A- rating into fire as well, which is why I heavily invested a lot more points into that stat too, making that damage scale up even higher and making the weapon dealing a lot more damage. Moving on to number 5, I didn't know this until much later, but you can actually issue commands to your companions to force them to use their special moves. This is done by pressing the R1 button plus either up or down on the D-pad for each of the companions you have with you. This in turn will consume some of your spirits, but I noticed that it forces them to be a lot more aggressive and also makes them cast their martial arts attack a lot more often. We already discussed how companions are kinda like the summons in Elden Ring, making things a lot easier without necessarily having to affect the HP or the damage from encounters. Plus, every single one of them will provide some really awesome 4-star armor, which early on is by far the best way to get your hands on that type of gear. And speaking of companions, you can actually level up your friendship with all of them very fast by simply refarming the Cups of Cordiality from a chest in the Demon Fort of the Yellow Heaven in Chapter 2. Also big thanks to the user Pac-Man for pointing this out to me the other day. You just need to make your way past the starting cave, avoid all of these enemies, and just try to reach this like larger area with a major flag right before the bigger courtyard leading to the boss fight. Once you do reach this place, you will notice that there's a treasure chest that will always drop a Cup of Cordiality, and you can simply reload that level over and over again to get these in no time. I believe it takes only 1.5 minutes, maybe even less than that, to get one per each, and each one of these cups will provide 2 levels of friendship. You can literally farm all of these in no time and get all the awesome 4-star gear from all of the companions. Moving on to number 7, another great function the game has is the ability to return to the last unfinished main battlefield with all the flags and the morale points unlocked up until that point and not having to risk losing them. So if you get stuck, for example, at a story boss and you need to refarm some stuff or get some better gear and even more so more levels, you can just abandon that level and go to a previous one, farm over there, because you can just come back at the exact same spot right before the end boss at any given moment. You can even see the prompt on the bottom right corner of the screen, and once you're done with farming and getting your character up to speed, you can just go back exactly where you left it without having to restart anything. So comes in quite handy and you don't have to worry about any of these issues. Moving on to number 8, you can actually break off enemy parts, which doesn't just severely affect the spirit meter but also ensures they no longer use that body part and attack against you during that fight. You can see which limb that is, as it tends to be covered completely in red crystals, and it's usually a hand, tail or horns, but actually all mobs have them, and many times even the ones that don't visibly show it. There are a few ways to break them off, with the most straightforward being the deflection mechanic. This is especially useful against larger enemies that tend to throw things at you or extend certain limbs towards you. If you parry, or well, in this case deflect them at the right moment, you can either rip them off or even throw them back and completely shatter them, preventing for the remaining of the duration for the bosses or the enemies to use them. However, there's a second way of doing it, which is basically attacking that part repeatedly with normal and martial arts attacks. Eventually, if you do this successfully and deal enough damage with especially attacks like the Skyward Evergreen or the Beckoning Pine, you can break off these parts, shatter them, and the boss not only will not use them, but you can more easily stun them right after that. Moving on to number 9, a way to make stealth assassinations much easier is to make sure to use the parry button to slow down your movement. It's actually not required on the controller since you can just control the speed of your character a lot easier, but if you play on the PC, for example, you can just hold down the parry button, which in this case is going to just slow down your movement so you can approach the target in silence and perform a fatal strike right away. This made assassinations a lot easier for me, and I can basically do them 100% of the time without risking detection, even with a low investment into stealth or the water stat. And finally, to number 10, you want to pay attention to the shared morale mechanic that all big enemy groups have. Oftentimes, you will notice that there's a number of adds and one lieutenant that all share the same morale, where if you take down multiple targets, the remaining morale and the spirit meter of the other targets that are still alive will severely go down, making them a lot easier to stun. So there's a few ways in which you can do this in. One of them is by just taking the smaller ad targets down one by one, which is going to make the final lieutenant a lot easier to take down. But if you have the damage for it and if you can perform an assassination, you can take down the lieutenant first, which is going to severely impact their spirit gauge, leaving them 1 or 2 attacks away from being fully stunned. Even more so, pay attention to the shamans that you find very often nearby groups, as they do tend to also buff that morale meter for most of these enemies, and taking them down means having 3 or 4, sometimes even 5 less points for the enemies, making them a lot easier to take down. And yeah, that's pretty much it with the biggest mistakes. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.